Bill was right. The walk and the fresh air did a lot of good for my mind and body. I didn't realize how tight and tense I was until the warm sun relaxed my bunched muscles and the constant crick in my neck began to loosen. As we walked and talked about nothing in particular, I began to wonder a little about my host. Here I was, a stranger from a bar, walking and talking and, in general, sharing my most intimate life with a man that I knew nothing about, other than the little he told me. The fact that I believed him without thought was strange in itself. Maybe now was the time for some question for him. Tell me a little about yourself, Bill. You say you were married for a long time? Yes, my wife Mary and I were married for a little over 42 years. We met in college and married after graduation, back in '61. She taught school right here in Dayton while I opened a practice later after I finished my internship at a hospital in Fort Wayne. We were very happy here, and neither of us ever wanted to see other parts of the world. Oh, we took the vacations to Mexico and Canada and once to Bermuda, but other than that, this was our world. How did she die? Was it an illness, or do you mind my asking? Mary died of cancer about a year ago. She died at home in bed, with me lying next to her. She died in her sleep. I remember waking up and knowing right away that she was gone. When you sleep with someone for that many years, you know right away. Bill retreated into his own memories then, and we just walked together for another 10 minutes before Bill stopped and turned around. I think it's time we got back. It's getting a little chilly. It was very warm for September, but I followed him back inside. It was time to get on with it. Where was I? Oh yes, I remember. I was telling you about our life and our life together. Well, as I said, Beth and I enjoyed it with each other, and we were sort of adventurous. We did a little of everything at least once, and we finally found those things we liked. We stayed with them, varying a little for fun. Beth liked giving and receiving BJ, and so did I, so that became a staple of our lovemaking. She also liked missionary best, so that was our choice. We never got into it, and neither of us missed it. But overall, our love life was great. One of the things Beth hated was my traveling. I didn't do a lot of it, but from time to time I had to take some overnights, and sometimes I would stay a few days, just because it was easier on me than a lot of back and forth driving. Beth never liked being alone, and neither did I, but I thought that the way I did it was best because I could be home more that way. Beth never saw it that way though. She always complained, mostly to make sure I knew how she felt. Never got into a heated argument about it until this last time. I had forgotten that we had dinner plans with our friends that night. I knew that I had to make the trip because I had a phone call earlier in the morning telling me of a major snafu that was going to cause a huge delay in the project if it didn't get fixed. That would mean a whole lot more of my time spent away on the site, so the only way to fix it was for me to make the trip and talk to the local contractor and see if there was something I could do to make him change his mind. I had the authority to make a deal right then and there, so I had no choice. But when I started to tell Beth, she blew up and started in on me. She wasn't going to listen to reason, and she had made up her mind that I did this just to piss her off. She was calling me names, and honestly, it pissed me off as well, so I just told her to shove it. Well, we really got into it, and she finally started crying, and she ran up to the bedroom and slammed the door. Rather than try to make it up to her, I was angry, so I just left without a word. That's how we ended it that day. But I felt so bad that I drove down to my office and spent a good 2 to 3 hours on the phone trying to see if there was any way in the world that I could avoid that trip. I called everyone connected with anyone and tried to make a deal that would avoid the delay, keep the project on budget, and allow me to stay home and make that dinner with Roger and Stacy and make Beth forgive me. It was on my mind, and I was determined to make it right. Well, perseverance and patience paid off, and by 11:30 that morning, I had made the deal and the project would proceed on schedule. The deal I made was very good, if I do say so myself, and I was quite proud of my incredible negotiation skills. I couldn't wait to tell Beth. I picked up the phone but then thought, what the hell? I left the office, went down the street to a florist that I had seen, and bought a bouquet of fresh-cut flowers. I decided to surprise Beth with a bouquet and an apology in person. Annabeth Chase. I sat down in front of the pond and just watched the golden flashes as the fish darted through the crystal clear water. The new pump and filter set Ben brought home last week was doing the job of keeping the water clear and clean. The goldfish seemed to like it. I just let my mind calm while I watched them. I was just drifting when I heard a voice from the side of the house. I looked up to see George Jenkins coming around the side. George, what are you doing here? Where did you come from?" "I'm sorry, Annabeth. I didn't mean to startle you. I knocked but no one answered, so I remembered you talking about your fish and decided to walk around to see if you might be out here, and here you are." "What are you doing here, George? I don't think it's a good idea for you to be here. I wish you would just go." "Please, Annabeth. I just wanted to apologize for what happened and plead with you to forgive me. I value our friendship and I couldn't bear it if we couldn't have that back. There's nothing to forgive, George. Now, please, just go away. Please." Rather than leave as I asked, George just came over to the bench and sat down beside me. He took my face in his hand and tilted it up to look into my eyes. "I won't leave until you forgive me, Annabeth. Will you do that?" I looked into those eyes and I was lost. I couldn't speak as he held my face in his hand. As I began to shiver, he bent down and kissed me just as he had the last time we were together. "God forgive me." I kissed him back. He rose from the bench and took my hands in his and pulled me up. He put his arm around my waist and led me back up the stairs into the kitchen. Once we were inside, he began to kiss me again, and now I gave in willingly. I felt his hands unbutton my blouse. He slid his hand. He slid my blouse off my shoulders and down my arms. He now used both hands on my exposed chest, and the pleasure I felt was agonizing. "Why don't we take this into the bedroom? I want to make love to you, my Beth. Let me give you the pleasure you deserve." I took his hand and pulled him up the stairs to our bedroom. I had a momentary thought of Ben, but it disappeared in a flash of anger. This was his fault for not being here where he belonged. As I walked to the bed, I turned and began to remove his shirt just as he had mine. We proceeded to undress each other, and soon we were both naked and ready. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took it in my hand. It was shorter than Ben's. I have to admit that at that point, I wasn't thinking. I was just reacting to, and there was nothing of love in it. It was simply lust, and I gave into it. Ben was not even in my mind. I wasn't cheating on him because at that point in time, he didn't exist for me. Only George, and his was real. Then I pushed him away and moved back up on the bed. I wanted George to F me now and hard. George was willing and ready. I lay back and waited. It was incredible. We lay together, George on top and me underneath him. I gave him some verbal encouragement, urging him on, which seemed to do the trick. He was slamming and I stopped pushing back since he had it under control. I was just beginning to feel an ending approach when I heard something. I looked toward the door and saw Ben. Ben Chase. I drove home with the flowers and an apology, which I continued to practice as I drove. I needed to make sure that Beth heard me loud and clear. I wanted nothing to come between her and I and our marriage. If the job was becoming too much, I would look for something else. I just needed her to know that, and to know that I loved her enough to do anything I could to make her happy. I would do it for her. I pulled into our drive and noticed the dark blue Range Rover parked out in front of the house. I didn't recognize it, but that wasn't unusual. We often had people parking in front of our house when there was a party in the neighborhood, or if someone was visiting the neighbors across the street, they had to park in the direction of travel or else get a ticket, so sometimes people just parked and walked across the street. Either way, it was not in my way, so I just ignored it. I took my flowers and walked into the house. It was quiet, which meant that Beth was probably upstairs in the spare room working on some of her signs and plaques for one of her charities. She spent a lot of time up there, so we had it fixed up quite nicely, with lots of light and plenty of shelves for her stuff. I went up the stairs quietly so as to surprise her. When I reached the landing at the top of the stairs, I started toward the right where the spare room was located when I heard sounds coming from our bedroom. I stopped and moved that way, holding the flowers out in front of me as a peace offering. I tiptoed my way to the door and looked in. What I saw almost caused me a heart attack. The picture is burned into my mind. I can't make it go away. It is as clear as a photograph and as hard to look at as a train wreck. But I'll describe it for you. I saw two people on our bed. The man was on his knees. He had his hands on Beth's hips. Beth was on her hands and knees. With her head down on the pillow, I vaguely remember hearing her saying something. His face was contorted, mostly in pleasure, I imagine. I didn't recognize him. That is the picture that I have ingrained into my brain. My wife, another man in our bed. It wasn't RP, and it wasn't a mistake. She was enjoying it. I could tell that from her face. It was all I needed to see. I threw the flowers away, turned and ran down the stairs to my car. I got in. started driving, and ended up here 2 days later. I haven't called or let her know where I am, and I don't want to. I don't know what I want to do. I know what my dad did, and now I know why. That was my story. I looked at Bill and was surprised to see his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had listened carefully and quietly to my story, and I had to admit that I felt much better now that I had told someone. I slumped down in my chair. Beth Chase. The shock of seeing Ben standing there was more than I could process. I just gaped at him with my mouth open, no words coming to mind. I was stunned. Ben? My Ben? He wasn't supposed to be home. He was driving west towards some godforsaken place in western Pennsylvania. I hadn't seen him, had I? Suddenly I realized what I was doing and what Ben saw when he looked in the doorway. I felt George behind me, while I knelt there on my hands and knees loving it. The panic hit, and I almost lost it. The sudden jolt to my system gave me the strength to rise up and throw George off of me, and ran to the doorway in time to see Ben's departing back as he went down the stairs and out the door. I was moving to try to stop him when I stepped on flowers scattered on the floor. I stopped as if I had run into a brick wall. I looked down at the bouquet of flowers, now spread across the hall, and I collapsed. I slid down to the floor, and the immensity of what I had done came down on my shoulders like a weight I couldn't support, crushing me down until I couldn't breathe. I struggled to find some air, but nothing was happening. I couldn't move, I couldn't cry, and I couldn't call for help. I just sat there, slumped against the wall, my bare feet surrounded by the blossoms of the flowers Ben had brought me. George came out into the hall, asking me what had just happened. He hadn't seen Ben, and he didn't know why I had run out of the room. I heard his voice, asking me what was wrong and what happened. I couldn't answer him. I just sat there leaning against the wall, my body obscenely visible to him. Suddenly, the whole thing became nothing more than a disgusting episode of a cheating wife a man she hardly knew in the bed she shared with her husband. Now the truth came back, and the truth made me sick. I scrambled up and ran to the bathroom, sick to my stomach and sick at heart. I closed and locked the door, turning to the commode just in time. When George came down to knock and ask if I was all right, I just cowered there on the bathroom floor, not answering until he went away. I stayed there for the next hour until I felt it was safe to come out. George had gone, thank God. I ran the shower on full hot and stood there letting it wash the shame away. I had no answers to give to Ben should he care enough to ask. I had no idea why I had done what I did with George there in our bed in our home. I had shame enough to fill the hole in my heart, but no answers. I didn't even know where Ben was, or when he would come back, if ever. Ben was not a man to accept what I had done. I had no choice now but to wait for his judgment. Bill Austin. It was clear to me now what Ben was feeling. His mother had betrayed his father, and the father was unable to come to grips with it. In the end, he decided to take his own life rather than try to face the reality of what his wife had done. Ben at that age knew nothing about fidelity or cheating, and all he saw was that his father had left him behind. That was all the reality a boy his age could understand. Further, because of the trauma of her part in her husband's death, the mother fought a losing battle with guilt, remorse, and loss. She was also unable to face the pain that she had caused her husband, and she took her life as well. Both of these actions were interpreted by Ben as desertion. Both his parents had deserted him and left him to fend for himself. He grew up believing that, never knowing the real story until he reached 18. By that time, the man he was to become had already been formed. The truth then was more academic than anything else. Annabeth, Ben's wife, had cheated on him with another man. Ben had to come to grips with that somehow, but his coping mechanisms were formed all those years ago in a house with very similar circumstances. But even though he now understood the reasons for his parents' actions, he subconsciously saw only the facts. His mother cheated, causing his father's death. His father's death caused his mother to kill herself. Now, his wife had cheated. His course of action was suggesting itself even now. That's why I told Beth that she had best stay away from Ben now. His actions were going to be difficult to predict given his history. Beth obviously wasn't aware of that part of his past, and she didn't understand the irony of what she did. Infidelity was bad enough, but to a man with Ben's past, it could be deadly. It was very likely that someone was going to be hurt. I looked at the clock, surprised to find that we had talked away the morning and part of the afternoon. I finally got up telling Ben that we should get some dinner and then talk some more. When he told me that I had heard all of his story, I just laughed and said that we had so much more to talk about now that I knew his background. It caused him to tense up a little, but I assured him that we would not be doing any really deep stuff, and that he was only a little crazy. That got a laugh, so I let it slide for now. I thought that we could go back to the bar where we met yesterday for some dinner and a few beers. Ben was certainly more relaxed now, and I wanted to keep him that way. Ben Chase. Telling Bill my story had really wiped me out. I was as tired as if I had spent the day working in the mill like my daddy. My back was sore, my legs ached, and I felt as though I could sleep for a month. Part of that was tension, part fatigue, and part emotion. I didn't know which was which, I was just beat. When Bill suggested that we had more to talk about, I guess I didn't want to hear that, but then he broke the tension with his crazy comment and then suggested we go out to eat. I could eat, and I wanted a beer in the worst way. So off we went. At the bar, things seemed about the same. It was later now than it had been when I first met Bill, and there were many more people around. Seems Bill knew a lot of them since there were greetings flying all over the place. He seemed to be very popular, a regular. I watched him interact with several and found him to be smooth and easygoing. That was my impression of him too, so I guess he was just what he seemed. We moved to a table and Bill ordered burgers and onion rings for both of us with a cold beer. I relaxed back and looked around. I watched several nice-looking women move in on some of the guys and concluded that they were pros. When I mentioned it to Bill, he just nodded affirmatively and let it go. Fine with me. While I was downing the burger, I saw a well-dressed woman about my age come into the bar, look around, and then move onto a stool. She was quite good-looking and very polished. She looked different than most of the pros, and I watched as several guys made a move on her, all of which she rebuffed. Interested, I began to watch to see what she was doing. I noticed a man at the other end of the bar looking in her direction, but otherwise making no move. Now I was fascinated and continued to watch. My curiosity was rewarded when she nodded her head slightly in his direction, slid off the stool, and went toward the restrooms. The man at the bar followed. I told Bill that I wanted to use the restrooms and followed them. I hung back, watched as they came together in the hall, not noticing me pressed back against the wall in the shadows. They whispered, and then she reached out her hand and pressed it lightly against his cheek. That's when I noticed the wedding ring. She moved away and walked back to the bar. He did the same, except that he put some money on the bar and went out the door rather than return to his seat. Within a minute, the woman left as well. I knew that I had just witnessed a clandestine meeting, and the woman was probably married and wanted to meet her lover. They had come here separately and then left to be together. I knew that somewhere, some man was being CC, just like me. All of a sudden, the pain and grief that I felt that night at home came crashing back. Along with the pain came a feeling of rage. Rage so intense at the stupid bee and her lover. What in the hell were they doing? Someone should teach them both a lesson. I gasped, struggling to breathe, and I felt the blood drain from my head. I was almost in danger of passing out when I rose from my seat to almost run from the bar into the cool night air. I crashed out the door, looked around for them, but they were gone. Suddenly the rage just evaporated and I staggered to one side and bent over, trying to catch my breath. The hamburger I had just enjoyed came back up in an explosive purging. I heaved everything I had and continued to heave, cramps clutching at my gut till I cried out in pain. I was sweating and fighting for control when I felt Bill's hand on my shoulder. Don't fight it, Ben. Let it control you first. Let it run its course. You have no choice but to allow it free rein. It will pass. Just let it go. Don't fight it. Just breathe. Easy breaths, easy breaths. His words didn't mean much, but his soothing voice helped. The rage which had threatened to overcome me had disappeared. I forgot the pain and the discomfort and concentrated on his voice. Don't fight. Let go. Over and over until I could finally hear the words and begin to follow his advice. I was shivering uncontrollably, but the cramps began to loosen. Blood began to flow into my brain again, and I was able to straighten up and lean against the cool bricks of the outside wall of the bar. Things began to register, and I felt the coils of tension loosen and finally break free. I took several deep breaths, bringing oxygen back to my starving lungs. The shivers passed, and I saw Bill standing there with a worried look on his face. I tried to smile at him. I'll be okay now. It's passing and I feel much better. Sorry I scared you. Can you tell me what happened? Do you know what set this off? It's important to tell me what happened. Can you do that? I shook my head yes and took a couple of deep breaths, feeling the bands around my chest slip away and my breathing become normal again. I was watching a woman at the bar. She was my age, quite pretty and well-dressed. She wasn't a pro because she rebuffed several of the guys who tried to pick her up. I noticed a man at the other end of the bar, and I saw them looking at each other. I followed them when they went toward the restrooms, and I saw them kiss and exchange words. Then he left the bar, and she followed within a few minutes. I knew then that they were meeting and that she was cheating on her husband. That's all I remember, till now. Bill was shaking his head in apparent understanding. He must have known who she was since he never bothered to say anything when he saw me looking at her. He seemed to be satisfied about what I told him, but for the life of me, I didn't know why. But he decided it was time for us to head back to his place, and that's what we did.